Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of the 2022-23 year. This is the Education and Civil Rights Initiative's webinar series. And today, Dr. Dixson, our Executive Director, will be speaking to us about Black teachers and developing their socio-political consciousness in dangerous times. So for today's presentation, we're going to begin by introducing the center to those of you who are joining us for the first time this year, and our mission and our vision, who we are and the work that we do. And then I will pass it over to Dr. Dixson to talk to us about some of her ongoing work. So again, we are the Education and Civil Rights Initiative. We are based in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. And our founding principle is that education is a civil right for everyone. In framing that, we coalesce around a mission statement that the mission of the ECRI is to work collaboratively with appropriate partners to ensure education is a civil right through research, community partnerships, and innovative and responsive scholarship. If you believe that you would be one of those appropriate partners, we will have our website up at the end and invite you to reach out to partner with us in work to advance education as a civil right. Our vision statement is that the ECRI envisions a society that affirms the immutable characteristics and intersectional identities of all people, including but not limited to those who identify as or are members of African American and Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, First Nations or Indigenous, LGBTQI+, diversely abled, first generation, and immigrant communities. And as we think about our identity as an initiative, we anchor ourselves in the Adinkra symbol, Karante Ne Akwamu. And for this year, that's our focus. It's a symbol of democracy, sharing ideas, and taking counsel. Adinkra symbols originate in West Africa, specifically in the lands that are now called Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire. And the symbols belong to the Ashanti or Asante people, and to this day are incorporated into cloth, metalwork, and pottery. And Adinkra symbols hold the traditions, the values, and histories of the Ashanti people, and each symbol represents an enduring concept. And in that frame, we have other symbols that we hold close as we do this work. And those include the Nkonsen, the chain or unity and community, which you see in the upper left-hand corner, Sapao, the executioner's knife, which symbolizes justice, Nea Onim, knowledge and learning, which we place in the center. The conjoined crocodiles in the lower left, which represent unity and diversity and a common destiny. And the Sankofa, so looking to the past for lessons that guide our future, and an acknowledgement that mistakes are never so big that they cannot be undone. We have a robust team this year. As I stated, you'll be hearing shortly from Dr. Adrienne Dixon, who is our Executive Director and an amazing scholar and AERA Fellow. I am Dr. Sarah LaCour. I am an assistant professor here and the Assistant Director of the initiative. And hidden from us right now, but manning the tech for this webinar and all of our webinars is Miss Mariama Lockington. She's our Chief of Staff. She is an amazing author of young adult fiction. And then we have a robust team of graduate research assistants, Ms. Tiaja Martin, Mr. Onesimo Banda, Mr. Aaron Booker, and Mr. Jesse Hayden, who help us complete our research and engage with our community partners. This year, our programming is focused on two areas. This webinar series, which we will hold the second Thursday of every month, October, November, December, January, February, and March, from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And typically in that, the last half hour is reserved for question and answer. And then for those of you familiar with our spring conferences from the past 2 years, we are reformatting that a bit this year to focus on small groups centered around problems of practice and the scholarship that informs them. So we look forward to partnering with many of you as we engage in this work. We're also currently accepting proposals for future webinar programming. The next 2 months, we will be looking at the price of opportunity from a scholar out of the University of Wisconsin, thinking about how much it would cost to provide every student with an educational opportunity to overcome the systemic and social barriers. And work from Dr. Shannon Sampson in the Evaluation Center here at the University of Kentucky, thinking about how we engage in a culturally competent manner when conducting evaluation work and determining, for example, the methodology that will allow every voice to be heard. If you have other big ideas for advancing education as a civil right, we invite you to submit a proposal and partner with us in this webinar. Today's webinar, as we mentioned, is about Black teachers and developing their socio-political consciousness in dangerous times. Again, anchoring ourselves in the Adinkra symbol, focusing on the sharing of ideas. The ECRI is also engaged in ongoing scholarship. You can find our work in blogs, white papers, journal articles, and in symposia, including our presentation at the upcoming AERA 2023 annual conference. And we are also looking for partners to engage in large research projects. So if you have an idea or if you need some research, we are happy to partner with community members in both practice and scholarship. One of the ways that we engage our community is through our advisory board, but we also are in collaboration currently with the Lexington NAACP and with Fayette County Public Schools and the local Lexington Fayette County urban government. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Adrienne Dixson, our amazing executive director and the presenter that you are all here to hear from this evening. Dr. Dixson.
Thank you, Sarah. That was awesome. Thank you so much. And I want to say I am really excited to be a part of the Kentucky family and working with this group of my team, who are wonderful and amazing individuals in their own right. But I think we work very well together, and this has been a refreshing opportunity for me to be a part of ECRI. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about an emerging project, but I want to give some context for it. And so the project is, I'll talk about the name of the project, but ostensibly it's supporting African-American teachers in New Orleans. And so I want to give some context for teacher demographics, and we'll talk about why all of this matters. But in the US, there about 79% of all teachers identify as white, non-Hispanic. There's some recent research done by the Pew Research Center and the NCES, or the National Center for Education Statistics, offers some kind of wonderful data every year or every few years on the status of education from across a number of sectors. But in the latest data is 2017, 2018. So this graphic, it roughly represents kind of, again, the demographics of teachers. So Black teachers make up about 7%. And you may hear, when you hear folks talk about Black teachers, and particularly Black male teachers, they'll say, well, Black male teachers are only 2% or only 3% of the population. Black teachers in general in the US only make up 7%. So if Black male teachers make up 3%, then Black women teachers only make up 4%. So it's negligible. Black women are not overrepresented in terms of that particular group. So for Black teachers in general, they are woefully underrepresented, just relative to their own numbers in the US, and also relative to the number of Black students who attend schools in the US. Latinx teachers are only 9%, so not much more than African-American teachers. Asian American teachers about 2%, and Indigenous First Nations barely register. So all told, teachers of color make up about 20% of the teacher force. But again, relative to the numbers of students of color, we're still woefully underrepresented. So that's, that's an issue when we think about kind of, again, the who's teaching and what this means for students of color. And later we'll talk about kind of the kind of politics of all of this. But for students of color, they often go to school and have teachers who don't necessarily represent or have experienced life in the US similar to them in terms of, kind of racial experiences. Let's go to the next slide and look at students. So you'll see that students of color actually make up a large percent in public schools. So again, there is this kind of what we call the kind of demographic imbalance or an imperative when we think about increasing the numbers of teachers of color in schools. So in the US, 47% of all students identify as white, but a larger percentage of students are students of color. 27% are Latinx, about 15% are African American or Black, 5% Asian American. And again, I think because we just don't do a good enough job of kind of with documentation, less than Indigenous and Native American students barely register, but I think it's, again, how we collect that data. But the percentage of students, of white students in public schools are actually diminishing, and there's some argument around birth rate. That's not necessarily what I'm going to focus on today, but I do think it's important, again, to think about the percentages of students of color who make up the bulk of public schools and public schools relative, again, to their numbers overall. All right, let me go to the next slide. And so I want to kind of lay out kind of broadly the national demographics relative to teachers in the context, like who's in school and who's teaching. There is some, again, research from economists who've looked at the impact of teachers of color on the achievement of students of color, and have found actually that when we match teacher and student demographics, there are some positive, there's a positive correlation to impact, to achievement. And then other research on what we call culturally relevant pedagogies. Thomas Dees is one of the economists who's looked at that, and the kind of positive impact that curriculum that addresses the cultural context and racial context of students of color has some positive impact on their achievement. So we do have some quantitative data, although we have a plethora of qualitative data on how impactful this, both teacher demographics and culturally relevant curriculum. But it's important to note that more recently our colleagues in econ have looked at that and have found that that these things matter. So we need the field to kind of catch up. So that's the context in New Orleans, where I concentrate most of my work. Is the public school landscape shifted across the state, but more acutely in New Orleans, where the school district now is 100% charter, which is a little deceptive because there aren't 107 schools in the district now. We're probably under 100, but close to maybe about 85 schools. All of them are charter schools now, meaning they are not under the purview, the direct governance of a elected school board, but individual school boards that are selected by the charter management organization. So people who write charters directly manage schools. And we have an elected school board that governs the charter management organizations at a bigger level. So it, ironically, and for ed reformers who have take issue with bureaucracies, have actually created a larger bureaucracy, but that's beside the point. So we are in a school we're in a public school system of systems is how they call it. And that raises a host of labor issues along with, you know, learning issues and curricular issues. But if we just focus on the labor piece, each of them have each 80, and there are 85 schools. Some are governed, some charter management organizations have multiple schools that they govern, but we have as many different employment and HR policies and hiring processes and et cetera. So that creates quite an issue for how, one, we count demographics. So some of the numbers actually are misleading, and it makes it difficult to find out who's in schools because it's not uniform how they count them and then what their process is for hiring. And I'll go to the next slide. So what does this mean? In the system of systems with 85 schools that have 85 different school boards, what does this mean? It means we have a loss of a democratically elected school board because parents, community members don't get to choose their school board, and the school board is incredibly important and powerful, and they make policy and they hire. And so parents virtually have no say in you know, in a system of representative government where you don't have a representative. We also have a more diminished and itinerant workforce in the city, probably across the state, but I focus mostly on New Orleans. So with Katrina, all of the teachers and paraprofessionals and all the staff in the public school district, previously known as the Orleans Parish School Board, all of them, that workforce, were terminated and replaced primarily with Teach for America and the New Teacher Project. Our cafeteria workers were swapped. They hired a Sodexo, so were replaced by large food service companies. Same with custodial staff. So where public schools had been a huge employer in the city, now the public school as an employer has been replaced by contract work for large companies that may or may not hire locals and offer them a living wage, which we actually can't enforce unless individual school staff at schools organize and protest. So we've seen that happen. There were executive orders at the federal level by George Bush that changed the existing charter law when Katrina happened in New Orleans. And so that allowed for kind of corporate charter groups to come in and establish charter schools, and federal funds were earmarked for the development of charter schools, as well as philanthropic dollars were earmarked for charter schools, and with stipulations that they only hire from Teach for America or alternative teacher organizations like the New Teacher Project, or one we have here that's regional called Teach NOLA. So effectively circumventing traditionally trained teachers and severely compromising the teachers union because charter schools were not refused to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with the local union, and the school board, because they don't directly manage school, had no mandate to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with the union. So again, it created a challenge for labor, and in particular for teachers and the quality of their work life. We can go to the next one. Yes. So what does this all mean in terms of what does it look like now after all this change? We have a very high teacher attrition rate at 30% annually, and often if we were able to look at school by school, we would probably find that their attrition rates are higher, but because they only have to report annually, we only know what the annual attrition rate is. However, we know anecdotally that teachers leave often in the first week of school, certainly before Christmas. And so there's a high teacher churn. There is an organization called Teach NOLA. Initially, their mission was to provide replacement teachers for the teachers who had left at Christmas. So Teach NOLA teachers would often start after the Christmas break because internally reformers knew that teachers weren't lasting through Christmas. And so if you were a Teach NOLA teacher, your training period would go from the summer and you would start in January, effectively after Christmas, so that there was there's a kind of constant turnover of teachers. But what we know officially annually is that there's a 30% turnover rate. And what does this change mean in terms of, again, a constant kind of churn of teachers, is that it hasn't positively impacted achievement as we know it. ACT scores, which again is deceptive. Schools are required by the state performance score to have every student take the ACT. So this isn't a voluntary score. Kids have to take the test. And the score is at 15, which is they're not even eligible to be admitted to the largest, quote unquote flagship state school, LSU. So we're not seeing an increase in achievement. And while we have some data on this impact on students with disabilities, those numbers are also, it's hard to know fully the impact because not all students receive IEPs and are formally in the special ed system. So we don't really know, but we do know, we can see that their numbers are severely hampered as well. Okay. The next slide, I just share this because it gives a little bit of a perspective on kind of how teachers view hiring and hiring practices in charters, and that they feel, again, this is anecdotal, that often they are undesirable for some charter schools, and that just by virtue of who they are, regardless of their training and credential, that they are not as a desirable hire, and that often jobs will go to white teachers who are, or white people, they might not even be teachers, who are underprepared for the job. And so that's the kind of context that has kind of led me to some of the work that we were doing. Again, my research, I've been here on the ground kind of trying to understand ed reform, and over we know that how critical teachers are, and there's very little work on the experiences of Black teachers and then what this means for overall in terms of the vitality of our communities and the impact on kids learning and learning. So I'll go to the next slide. And so I, along with some colleagues, received a very generous grant from the Kellogg Foundation that is really interested in impacting communities and studying and supporting work that will make a difference in local areas. And so we're fortunate that our regional Kellogg program officer was interested in kind of the supporting a Black teacher pathway. And what we were more interested in, not preparing teachers, because they're not preparing teachers, but the issue that we're facing is keeping teachers in classrooms. So the recruitment piece isn't necessarily a challenge as much as it is keeping teachers, and then supporting teachers, some of whom are now veteran because the ed reform has been in place here since 2005. So teachers have been here at least 10 or 15 years if they stayed in the classroom, and supporting and inspiring them to stay on. And so the Kellogg grant gave us an opportunity to provide kind of critical professional development for teachers over a school year and into the summer. And so we have not completed the data analysis, but I will, I'm happy to kind of talk about more about the work that we've started with teachers by offering public events and some more targeted event workshops in the summer, and focusing on, again, on their kind of helping to develop them in what we're calling cultural, well, not what we're calling, but in culturally relevant pedagogy, which seems to be the buzzword for a lot of folks nowadays. But we know that it has a longstanding kind of research base to support it, but providing that targeted professional development for Black teachers with the hope that they will stay in the classroom longer. And also we wanted to continue to develop their skills. So I'm going to stop on that piece so that Sarah and I can talk a little more about the work. And thank you all for that piece. So Sarah, I'm ready to chat.
Oh, thank you. I am so intrigued by this work. And I think many of our partner organizations are going to be very interested. So one of my jumping in points, right, as a JD PhD, I always go back to the law. And I've heard a lot of scholars in their critique of Brown say that that is really what set us up for this demographic mismatch in teachers. White parents in particular didn't want their students being taught by teachers of color, so the Black teaching force was fired, and we've just never recovered from that. Is that how you understand it? And can you walk us through that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. I think that what I think is really interesting is that wasn't necessarily the case in Louisiana. And I haven't looked across the South, so I can't say across the South, but I can say in New Orleans, we actually didn't have a loss of Black teachers post-Brown in the way that we would feel there just wasn't a significant loss. So the actual Black teaching force was very robust here in New Orleans, and like most places in the South, there were kind of dual systems, right? So and dual teachers unions. So there was a Black teachers union and there was a white teachers union. And at some point in New Orleans, the Black and white teachers unions, they united, and so they became the United Teachers of New Orleans. So they were separate, and they followed the kind of racial climate of the time. And so, but I think they felt, I can't say what I know they felt. I just know that they merged and they became the United Teachers of New Orleans, and were the first teachers union in the South, in the Deep South, to get a collective bargaining agreement. And I always say that that's significant because we're talking about, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, in the Deep South, that a group of teachers, most of whom were women, were able to get a collective bargaining agreement. That was just unheard of for teachers, and an interracial group of teachers. And so that was a huge win. And the United Teachers of New Orleans was a very powerful union across the South. And it had been an exemplar, it had been the standard for teacher labor rights, again, in the South. So it was a huge loss for public education when UTNO kind of was unable to get a collective bargaining agreement after Katrina. So we didn't have a huge loss of Black teachers in the same way that other states might have after Brown was passed. We actually, in the state of Louisiana, the teacher, in New Orleans, in New Orleans, the Black teacher force was over 80%, and upwards of 75% were Black women. So it was very robust. So teachers and school leaders, after Katrina, the reformers are now boasting that they're at like 50% Black teachers, but it's still significantly lower than what it was before Katrina. And the drop is tied to the kinds of reforms and the hiring practices that they engaged in, but also the rhetoric. So the national rhetoric was that the schools were terrible and that they had poor teachers. And my argument is, if you believe that, you have to believe that these Black teachers were just failing Black kids. And I refuse to accept that, in large part because I was one of them. And I know many teachers and principals in the state are paid. It wasn't like people were cashing checks, making money. So there was and that people had master's degrees, they had doctoral degrees. So they had options and chose to be there. And so I think it was an easy critique to say that, we just didn't have them, but we actually had in New Orleans, that just wasn't the case. And it probably is true across the state of Louisiana, that we just didn't experience the loss of teachers in the same way after Brown that other places may have.
Excellent. So that makes me think of another question that comes up from some of our partners. When we do our equity audits, one of the things we look at is the teacher workforce demographics. And we hear a lot from school districts that their problem isn't recruitment, their problem is retention. And in a lot of areas around the state of Kentucky, and I imagine around a lot of the country, there's concern that if we recruit teachers of color to a place where there isn't a robust community, that we're not setting them up to stay and to be happy, not outside of the school, right? Like as a person.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about how you've experienced that in your work? I imagine New Orleans is a little bit different than, Western Kentucky when it comes to community for people of color, but what is the role of that in supporting teachers?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's critical work. And there was, in the late 60s, probably early 70s, there was a National Teacher Corps. And there was a subgroup, and they may have been set up in a number of places, but one of my colleagues, Adrienne D, did a study on the National Teacher Corps in Rochester, New York, where there was specific outreach to teachers who had attended HBCU. So they were looking for HBCU grads and recruiting them to Rochester, because the concern was, and this was in the 60s, so the concern was with the desegregation efforts that there wouldn't be a teaching force that would match the demographics of the students. So once they desegregated and it was overwhelming, Rochester was actually a high wealth area because of where it was located, blah, blah, blah. And so there was specific outreach to Black teachers, and they came to Rochester, New York, from Alabama, from Louisiana, you know what I mean? So it's possible to get people there, and it created a network. And I would encourage folks to read Janine's piece. It's DINGUS, Janine Dingus. We'll find a link and maybe we'll be able to post it to our webpage. But she looked at the targeted kind of outreach to them and brought them there. Many stayed and created programming in Rochester. So I think there is a piece about creating community. But where I did my doctoral work in Madison, Wisconsin, there were teachers from Louisiana, from Arkansas, from Mississippi. In Madison, Wisconsin, which is, it's not the most diverse place, but again, these were folks who were recruited to Madison to teach for the small community of African Americans. But what folks were able to do was to create their community, create a community for themselves through churches and through civic organizations. And so I think the place-based issues, the place-based concerns can be an issue, but I think if we can work across civic organizations, I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta. In Janine's work, she found that folks establish graduate chapters of their Greek letter organizations, but also, other kind of social aid and pleasure clubs, if you will. And so they created community. And so I think if there's a way to connect and plug people in to social groups, and or civic groups that the recruitment isn't as challenging, but that's a bygone era. I don't know now what it is for millennials, but I know, but I think that being able to create community for folks, I think, is obviously important and can be helpful, I think, in recruitment.
And that, I think, leads me to my next question for you. You mentioned the TFA, TNTP recruitment and alt-cert programming. And do you think that part of the disconnect that you're seeing in New Orleans is because these organizations sort of recruit nationally? And, I have roots in Louisiana too. So it's a different place, right? Like there is a very defined culture. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that as contributing to some of the attrition, even as we recognize that we can recruit teachers from the South and help them build community in the North. Are we seeing sort of a reverse problem of that?
Right. Well, I think what I'm noticing is that because I've tried to plug in with groups of young folks who come into New Orleans from Teach for America specifically, and honestly, the union use this as a strategy as well to one, obviously they wanted to build base, but also because they were concerned about who was coming to teach kids. So I do think that, so what I know that happens is that Teach for America brings folks in and orients them, and I've heard and I've witnessed, orient them around what happened in New Orleans with a false kind of narrative about what happened. And if you've been through Teach for America, I did Teach for America in 1990, and it was the whole esprit de corps, right? You are the cream. I mean, we literally heard this every day. You are the cream of the crop. You're going to change public education, blah, blah, blah. And so as a way to be inspirational, but also it feeds into this kind of this us against them narrative, and you are the savior. And so a lot of young people come into New Orleans thinking that it was so terrible and anything I do is going to be better than anything that happened before. And they don't connect with the local community in a way that should be helpful for them and that is ultimately helpful for their students. Because if you understand the context and the culture and where your kids live, then you can be a more effective educator, but they're not connected to that. And there's such a negative, in New Orleans at least, and I would venture to say in a lot of places where Teach for America is, there's a negative perception of Teach for America because they don't connect in authentic ways to community. Teach for America does a really good job of kind of bracketing core members off from everyone else. And they've, and now in New Orleans and in many places where they are, in Birmingham, I've been to Birmingham, in Jacksonville, in Memphis, they've created their own kind of ecology where a Teach for America core member could just live their whole lives, never actually engaging with real people until they go to the classroom and they're engaging with real kids, but they may not talk to parents ever, right? And that, I think, is it's a challenge for any teacher, but specifically for folks who go through a program like a Teach for America, where that program is hostile to traditionally trained teachers, and there is a negative perception in New Orleans, at least. I would imagine it's similar in Memphis and other places where they've been that are experiencing the same kind of New Orleans style reform, is that they're often not welcome in spaces. And so, it's unfortunate for them because they'll go, and I've witnessed this, they've gone into places and they're afraid to say they're Teach for America, but people know that you're not a local, right? And that you're in a public school. And we know the history, like, I've seen people say, are you Teach for America? Yes, look, okay, then let us educate you. And if you're going to stay here, know this, and know what your presence means and what you can do to kind of course correct, because we care about our children, we care about our community. So I think I think there have been some deliberate actions and strategies on the part of Teach for America and other alternative teacher training programs that, and some that want to be Teach for America, where they make it difficult for their candidates to completely become members of community.
And in many ways that makes sense, right? We're here to disrupt. And
Yes.
so if
Yes.
we keep you separate
Yep.
from the community, then it's easier to disrupt.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple times like people in the classroom versus teachers. And so while we're on TFA,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about their recruitment, for example, of individuals of color to come to TFA because they're aware of this demographic imbalance versus the established, tenured, not in the like literal sense, but experienced Black teaching force that was displaced in the post-Katrina way?
Yeah. Well, so I think, so the challenges in New Orleans, we've started talking about from the, at the beginning of the reforms from 2006 on, folks were noticing that that we didn't have, Black teachers were fired. They weren't necessarily getting rehired. And that Teach for America was kind of here, and most of the teachers were white. Like everybody noticed that. And so there were problems with that. There were complaints and pushback and et cetera. And so in response, and I think this has been an abiding issue for Teach for America since its inception. The first core was in 1990 with 500 core members, and then I was 1991, we had 750. Out of the 750, there were 100 people of color, not 100 Black people, 100 people of color, right? So in a core, right, we knew the core knew where they were sending people. They weren't sending them to Scarsdale, right? We were sending people to the Bronx and to Brooklyn. We weren't sending people to Metairie, we were sending them to New Orleans. So, and out of that 100, we were going all of these different places. So there wasn't a critical mass of us going to each city, we were being spread out. And so that's an issue. And I'll say in my year, I said I wanted to go to New Orleans to teach. Why? As a young teacher, I knew that I needed to be somewhere where I was familiar. I didn't know that that meant I was culturally relevant. I just knew like, hey, I need to go where it's not completely foreign to me because I'm getting ready to do a job that I am not prepared to do, right? So the learning curve can't be too steep for me on a social level. Like I need to be somewhere grounded. And I had a sense that if I understood the culture, even though I don't know what I'm doing as a teacher, at least I will understand the context and the kids and the culture. And they initially were going to send me to Houston, and I refused to go. I was like, I'm not going to go then. I just won't do it. And at that time, Teach for America needed the numbers because they were building, right? So they needed the core to get bigger every year. So they acquiesced and sent me to New Orleans. But what often happens with core folks is that they pick, you pick a place and you're like, oh, New Orleans is fun, Mardi Gras. I get to go to Mardi Gras, I get to go to Jazz Fest. And they only know the culture on a superficial level, but it satisfies a strategic target on the part of Teach for America to quote unquote increase the number of people of color. And so there are very few people, I'm trying to think of folks I know, who did Teach for America and landed back in the city where they were from. It's the calculus often doesn't work out in that way. So you're just somewhere because you tick a box. And the clamoring has been, you need more people of color. Okay, we got them. And then you just have, a Black and brown body in a space that may have had a, kind of in a broader sense, a similar experience, except we know that culture and language and context matters. And you've now displaced someone who actually had all of the things that we know matter. For no reason other than an ideological, reason to support a system of reform that, as you're right, is a disruption. And so that has kind of been the strategy and the practice I've noticed in every place that the alternative teacher programs have been. In Chicago, Rahm Emanuel got in a lot of trouble, and teachers actually went on strike because they were refusing to honor the stipulation in the contract where if a school closed, when they had to hire from a pool of teachers, and seniority mattered. And there were a number of senior Black teachers who had the seniority. So he was doing a dual thing. He was closing schools, reopening them in other places, and then not replacing with veteran teachers, and had told people he didn't have enough money, but had secretly, and this came out in the press, signed a $10 million contract with Teach for America. And it's those kinds of things that unfortunately put the core member, who is the least powerful in all of this, makes them vulnerable, right, to all the vitriol that they'll experience from veteran teachers, who some refuse to work with them, which is to the detriment of the children, right? And then parents and community folk who are upset that you have this young, these young folks in our classroom, but this is because of the strategy of ed reformers. And so, so we've had just kind of a swapping of bodies without understanding what it means to have these bodies in the space, and that there is that there should be some meaning tied to it, and that you should be, ideologically at least aligned with your community, and sometimes often that's not happening.
So you addressed one of my next questions, which was this pay argument, right? So a first-year TFAer is cheaper than a 7-year experienced teacher of color. Given that teachers are the majority of school budgets, and I think you would agree with me that schools are incredibly under-resourced, public schools in particular, traditional public schools, number one. How do we answer that portion of the argument? That seems very logical on the one hand.
Sure. Well, I think we just do better at paying teachers in general, right? But I think that the investment across the state has to be, people have to live. Like, why should you, give a vow of poverty because you want to teach someone? But I think there's something more sinister at play. One, I think when you hire someone fresh out of school, out of college, this is their first professional job. They don't know what to ask for or know what to expect. You're brand new, you don't know what your rights are. You know what I mean? You just don't know. And so I think that reformers bank on the naivete of the new teachers. And when you're a veteran, you've been in here longer. They get cast as being curmudgeons, but it's like, I know what, I'm not doing that because I don't have to do that. When you're brand new, you don't know what to say no to. Right? So you just like, okay, stay until 7:30 and I don't get, okay, come in at 6 a.m. Sure. Call parents on a Saturday and I don't get paid for it. Okay. Right? You don't know that that's not normal. That's not normal. And it's not, and it's not reasonable to expect someone to live their lives like that. Now, I studied what I call, I studied Black teachers who that was their manner, but they did that voluntarily. They weren't mandated as part of their employment contract to come in at 6 a.m. and leave at 7 and to give their phone numbers to kids on the weekends, or to teach Sunday school, or to teach, like that was just who they were and that's what they did. But it wasn't mandated for them to do that, right? So I think part of it is, yes, schools are under-resourced, and so just economically, it makes sense that you hire the person who's cheaper, except that we're not a factory, right? We're not working in a factory, so we're actually impacting the lives of young people and ultimately our communities. And so we should compensate folks at a way where they can live. And there's most of these young folks, just their income is being supplemented by whatever their parents can help them with. Housing. In New Orleans, we've seen where families are, buying houses for their kids to live in because they can't afford it on the teacher salary, but it's a boon for their family because they can come for Jazz Fest. If you're a veteran teacher, I'm trying to keep my house, right? I want to have a house for my family. I don't, and their families are getting second homes, or their families are, and many of them, because they don't, they're young and they haven't thought about retirement, the charter management groups are not offering retirement. The healthcare is incredibly expensive to the point where it's almost prohibitive. So I've had friends who were single women who were like, I just can't afford to be a teacher. I need health insurance, or they're older, and this is where the veteran teachers were leaving, is because they were older and they needed healthcare. They just could live. I mean, the premiums were like 300, almost 600 a month. That's obscene. And if you hire someone fresh out of college and you just play the odds that they'll leave by the time they're 26, they don't really care about health insurance because they're on their parents' insurance, right? So you just run the odds. They're not thinking about retirement. They're 26. But if you're 40, you're thinking about retirement, right? You're like, okay, I need to start, So yes, on one hand, yes, but on the other, yes, it's cheaper to hire someone who's fresh out of school, but it also, what does it do, in the long term to our school? And so one of the things I looked at is what I call the kind of intergenerational exchange that you can get from a novice and a veteran and a mid-career, that kind of synergy that comes with varying levels of experience. And so, yes, you may have someone who's jaded because they've been in the system so long, but you have someone who's fresh-faced and they're full of excitement and blah, blah, blah. And so there could be some really great energy that we'll never have if you only, bet on the novice, right? So I'm not saying don't have novices because we have these really great veterans. I think that interchange is really important, but we don't get that. And that's to the detriment of our kids and our communities, I think.
All right, and we're wrapping it up, but I have one last question, because you mentioned about Rahm Emanuel with schools, and you said something earlier about there's this narrative that would suggest that we don't care about our schools, our children, and our communities. I was a TFAer in South Louisiana, but I'm also from Houston. And so Houston had a lot of that failing school narrative, school closures. And in almost every case, the families were out saying, don't close our school. You need to support our school, not shut it down. So can you talk a little bit about school closures in the context of teacher and community displacement?
Yeah. So I'll say for New Orleans, and I'll think about, and I'll try to talk a little bit about Chicago too. But in New Orleans, when the school closures came as a part of the kind of master planning for what the city would look like after Katrina, and there were projections about where people would live and blah, blah, blah. And so it would make sense to have schools here because there wouldn't be that many people there and blah, blah, blah. And some of that hasn't really borne out because people, went back to where they lived, right? Or people tried to go back to where they live, even in places where there are no grocery stores, very few social services available, and they have to leave. So in the lower 9, in the East, that are dense. They're dense in terms of population, but they just have no services, and that has been a disruption to life for families because the kids have to take buses now. So they're bused outside of their community. So you can imagine now grandma can't go pick you up, or auntie can't pick you up, or your nanny and nan can't go get you because it's really far. So we have kids who live in the 9th Ward, but they go to school way across the river on the West Bank, which is a huge, that's a you're traveling to do that. And just, participating in the life of the school. So and a lot of places, schools are the hub of the community. You vote there, right? Their public meetings, it's a space for public meetings. So all of that is disruption because the schools are not necessarily housed in communities, or kids don't go to schools in the communities in which they live. And so just being a part of the fabric of the community has been disruptive. In the case in Chicago, it's not, folks haven't quite figured out what Lori Lightfoot is following in Rahm's footsteps with closing schools, because it's mayoral run school. So the closures haven't quite made sense, again, given the density of where people live. And unfortunately, they've reopened schools in areas that are predominantly white. And so it's been hugely problematic for ROM. And in New Orleans, they've combined schools, and that didn't quite make sense, because so now you have a super high school where you didn't have a super high school before. So across the river, I think two or three schools were combined when it, and so now you just have a super high school, and it creates more issues than it solves. But yeah, I'll stop there because I know we're out of time.
We are approaching time. I was going to ask you any closing comments before we close out.
Yeah, I want to say, I think it is important to kind of study the labor rights and labor issues relative to teaching. The teaching and learning piece is incredibly important, but understanding how teachers experience work life and all that comes with being a part of the working class is understudied. There was like one study, Dan Lordy did a study in the 1970s that has not been replicated on the work life of teachers. And so we need to understand that because there are rippling effects, and some are really profound, obviously, for our students and our community. So I think we need to understand that a lot better. So thank you all for joining us. Sarah, did you want to close us out on this, or should I?
I will close this out. Thank you everyone for joining us for this first in our webinar series for the 2022-23 school year. We appreciate your time. If you found value in today's webinar and our work, if you're interested in partnering with us, or for more information or to support us, you can visit our website, which is education.uky.edu/civil-rights. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. That's UKY Civil Rights. And we look forward to partnering with you and to presenting additional webinars throughout this year. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.